Here's a history of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that many people don't know. Through successful slave revolts and organized struggles against chattel slavery, enslaved Africans forced the United States to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, known as the Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments, which occurred between 1865 and 1870, were intended to guarantee the freedom of the formerly enslaved Africans, grant them certain civil rights, and protect them and all citizens of the United States from discrimination. The 14th Amendment, ratified on July 9, 1868, granted citizenship to those born or naturalized in the United States and granted all citizens freedom, due process, and equal protection under the law. It expanded the scope of the Constitution's protection of individual liberties by protecting rights from the infringement by federal government and state and local governments. However, the 14th Amendment benefited big businesses more than it did freed Africans. In fact, the amendment has been the subject of more Supreme Court cases than any other provision of the Constitution. The first interpretation of the 14th Amendment had nothing to do with the freed Africans, but with big business. One phrase within Section 3 of the 14th Amendment states that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Ultimately, the Supreme Court would interpret this phrase to include a corporation. That is to say, the courts equated the word person with corporation. This interpretation looms large in the development of monopoly capitalist industry in the U.S. Now, how did this happen? Well, toward the end of the Civil War in the 1860s, the United States was in the midst of the Great Industrial Revolution and did not want government getting in the way of an individual's pursuit of the almighty dollar. The 14th Amendment was written so vaguely to leave room for lawyers representing big businesses to argue for the freedom of companies to pursue their economic opportunities without any interference from the government. The Slaughterhouse case was one of the most famous Supreme Court cases that granted corporations the same status as individuals. In 1869, a Louisiana statute granted a monopoly to a slaughterhouse company in New Orleans that required all the slaughtering of animals in New Orleans to be carried out by a single company for 25 years. Such an act deprived approximately 1,000 butchers of work. Consequently, some of those butchers sought an injunction against the monopoly, indicating that their 14th Amendment right had been violated. However, the U.S. Supreme Court favored the slaughterhouse company, setting in motion the United States policy of placing an individual interest over the people's collective will. The Supreme Court's favoritism toward economic interpretations of the law can be traced to the influence of large corporate interests who attempted to persuade court members to support their stance. As the Supreme Court changed during the Civil War, many new justices were heavily influenced by the American Bar Association, founded in 1878, and became a breeding ground for the gospel of laissez-faire, or the French word that means allowed to do. That is, to allow businesses to do whatever they want without government interference, like slavery. Unsurprisingly, the new justices wanted to protect the property interests of the emerging business corporations more so than the interests of the formerly enslaved Africans, many of whom had to endure the black codes in the era of Jim Crow segregation. In theory, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship, freedom, and due process to those born and naturalized in the U.S. But in practice, it gave corporations power over the people, leading to the growth of monopoly capitalism in the U.S., while continuing to deny Africans now born in America equal protections under the law.